We're a little late, but we're getting started anyway, okay? We're going to pick up where we left off, 3 weeks ago? 3 weeks ago, right? And to show you just how busy things have been, everything that I wrote up 3 weeks ago is still on the board. We finished by briefly introducing the concept of non-malfeasance. And we talked about the fact that it is an obligation for a healthcare professional to refrain from doing harm. And I think the last thing I said was, in particular, this has always been part of the Hippocratic Oath for doctors, all right? If a healthcare worker cannot bring good to their patient, if they can't be a benefit to their patient, then they are bound by duty to at least avoid doing harm. Now, under this principle of non-malfeasance comes negligence. Negligence is a departure from the standard of due care. It includes intentionally imposing an unreasonable risk on a patient, and it includes unintentionally imposing risks through carelessness. There is much debate under the principle of non-malfeasance about the whole issue of foregoing life-sustaining treatment. There are healthcare workers who view the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment as making themselves responsible for the patient's death. And virtually all healthcare workers at some point find themselves worrying about the distinction between withholding and withdrawing treatment. So let's talk for just a second. Withdrawing treatment refers to a treatment that has already begun that is then removed from the patient's chart. Withholding treatment refers to not beginning a course of treatment. A treatment that can be withheld can also be withdrawn. And under that first principle of autonomy, patients or their surrogates have the right to forego treatment at any time. They should base that decision on the consideration of the benefits and the burdens of the treatment. And that also can be said about a DNR order. Anybody remember what DNR stands for? Excellent group. The presence of a DNR order does not imply the withdrawal of other types of care. And like I said a minute ago, you have to evaluate each treatment according to the burdens and the benefits to the patient. This last point becomes something of a sticky wicket for family members, because when the patient has not exercised his or her autonomy with a durable power of attorney for health care, you can often find family members who want to make decisions about DNR withdrawing treatment on the basis of what benefit it will be for me and not necessarily for the patient. And that can be said of a spouse, it can be said of adult children, it can be said of, a distant relative. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that the Hippocratic Oath, which doctors take, says, first, in essence, says, first do no harm. If you read the Hippocratic Oath, if my memory is correct, you won't find those 3 words anywhere in it, but read the whole thing through, and by the end of it, you'll realize that all it's saying is first do no harm. 4 words. That statement is something of a double-edged sword. For example, morphine is given to relieve a terminally ill patient's pain, but it will also suppress their respirations. And if not administered carefully, thoughtfully, could bring about a patient's death. As long as the goal of administering morphine is the relief of pain and not the ultimate death of the patient, you can justify providing adequate pain control. All of this is called the principle of double effect, which I would try to write, but the tables are in my way. It's kind of hard for me to do that. The principle of double effect. All it says in the medical world is that the course of action chosen must be for the good. The good must not be a consequence of a secondary harmful effect. The principle of double effect says that harm can never be intended, and that the good that you're trying to do must outweigh the harm. If you go back to my brief example a minute ago, you have a terminally ill cancer patient. They need morphine to control the pain. If you decide to up the dose of morphine, but the respirations get slowed and the patient dies, if your intent was the relief of pain, then you were seeking the good. If your intent was to bring about death for the patient, then your intent was not good, and the increase of the morphine, therefore, is not justified. Now, just as a footnote to all of this, some of you have been in the military, and there is a principle of double effect that applies to the military in times of combat, and it's basically saying the same thing, that the intention of the strike must be for the good. And the collateral damage might be difficult to handle, but if your intent was the good, that's what counts. In the midst of all of this, going back to our patient receiving morphine, one of the key points is to not give a terminally ill patient enough pain meds for fear of their ultimately dying from that extra morphine is doing harm. So we use morphine. The fourth principle that is up here is justice. That says that healthcare professionals are to treat people fairly, equally. It can refer to a fair and equal distribution of healthcare resources. When was it? About 5 years ago, when we had the H5N2 96745 flu or whatever the name of that, you know what I'm talking about. You may remember that in the fall of that year, when everybody was panicked about it, we did not have enough flu vaccine. The justice principle immediately kicked in because you may remember that they said seniors over 70 and infants and children under 5 would get the vaccine, and the rest of us in the middle would have to fend for ourselves until the manufacturers were able to get enough product out. That's the justice principle. That's treating people fairly and equally under the distribution. It means that some of us didn't get it, but the other side of it is we were all being treated fairly because those of us in the middle could conceivably throw off the flu better than those at either end. Justice principle also refers to just access to health care and just allocation. And the justice principle says that those making healthcare allocations must be free from the influence of personal financial benefit. In other words, this is what has led to some hospitals saying that doctors can no longer receive those pens and the water bottles and the cups and everything else, the notepads that were always lying around that they would get from the pharmaceutical companies, in order that the justice principle is upheld. We talked early on, word is up there, 2 words are up there, about prima facie nature of these principles. And we said that prima facie simply means at first glance. Okay? A prima facie duty is a duty that is always to be acted upon unless it conflicts with a particular situation or with an equal or stronger duty. And the prima facie duty is always right and binding. Now, generally speaking, in the healthcare world today, the prima facie duty is autonomy. And we see that in the informed consent forms that we are often asked to complete when we go to the doctor's office, go to the hospital. If you've ever been in a clinical trial, you might get a 20-page informed consent. Autonomy today is the prima facie duty. However, it is the one to be acted upon unless it conflicts in a particular situation with an equal or a stronger duty. And this is where, in the world of healthcare, the patient has autonomy. What happens when the patient's autonomy prevents the healthcare professional from being a benefit to the patient? And that, as we said last time, somebody who is hell-bent on committing suicide. One can argue it's their autonomy. A healthcare professional has to be a benefit to that person. And sometimes that means that the person will be put in restraints to keep them from jumping out of a window or breaking a bottle or whatever the case may be. More than one principle can appear to be prima facie in a given situation, and your actual duty will be determined by examining all of these duties, all the responsibilities, which is why sometimes when we have loved ones who are in ICU, for example, and they're moaning, they're semi-conscious, they're moaning, they're in pain, and the family wants to ease the pain. But the healthcare professional realizes that they have given them as much of the pain med as they can, given their size, their weight, the situation, but the family is having problems with the clear moaning, and you've got the family saying they wouldn't want to live this way. You've got the healthcare professional saying, I can't do any harm. competing responsibilities. Another situation, just as an example of where these principles can compete. We all know that a healthcare professional has a prima facie duty to do no harm by maintaining the confidence of their patient. We also know that the patient has the autonomy over their healthcare information. What does a healthcare professional, a doctor, a nurse in particular, do when they have a patient, for example, who has tested HIV positive, but insists that he or she will not tell their spouse because the way they got HIV positive was, of course, outside of the bonds of marriage? What does a healthcare professional do? Violate the patient's autonomy? Violate confidentiality in order to be a benefit to the spouse, or do you protect it? And there are no simple answers. So don't ask me. Yeah, Chuck.
I just throw in one thing. You do have the intrusion of outside law, though, where if you become aware that somebody's about to do criminal acts, as a pastor, as a doctor, you have obligations. And similarly, they're often, with HIV, there also are reporting.
There are, but
there's one other factor that comes in that also conflicts.
But one of the things that I want us to think about, he's absolutely right, there are laws out there. I mean, on the HIV thing, there are laws out there. Teenage pregnancy, there are laws out there. But if we are going to be ethical in our decision making, we have to know the foundation, the ground from which we start, before we have to resort to the law. In other words, the law is good, but as human beings, and in this context as Christians, how do we make these kinds of decisions? And I want to challenge us to start thinking about how to make them apart from the law. Okay, shift of gears. What is life?
Magazine.
How much does it cost?
25 cents.
I don't have 25 cents.
That's life.
What's life? Never mind. Those of us, he doesn't remember this, but those of us of a certain age used to do that when we were younger, which I've instructed him on. Oh, well, see, there we go.
I can't be taught.
He can be taught. All right. Here's one definition for you. Life refers to living organisms that are autopoietic systems, self-constructing, self-maintaining, energy transducing, autocatalytic, which entities.
Tiffany would tell you they have to breathe, they have to...
That's what I said.
Yeah.
What? I mean, come on. Didn't you hear that? That's a scientific definition of life. Energy transducing, receives energy from one system, retransmits it in a different form to another. Autocatalytic, causing chemical changes by adding a substance which is not permanently affected by the reactions. I mean, we all know at one level, yes, that's what our bodies are doing all the time. I want to suggest to you that the question of what is life is a question that is too hard to answer at some level. Scientists try to define it clinically, legislators legally, and if you remember the Terry Schiavo case from almost 8 years ago, such definitions, you remember, prove useless. Is it something spiritual? Is life something eternal? Is life good? And if you are a Presbyterian, is it predetermined? Now, Greek and Hebrew, the languages of our Bible, both say the same thing about life. They say that the word life denotes a physical vitality. It's not a thing, it's a vitality. We have no firm scientific definition. Did you know that there is no single test to establish the presence or absence of life? And despite all of its nitty-gritty details of molecular makeup, science is incapable of defining when life begins and when it ends. Now, we become frustrated, we human beings. We want to know, when does life end? When does death occur? You remember those old westerns? Bang, bang, ah! Yeah, he's dead. Or the old war movies. Bang, bang, ear to the chest. Yeah, he's gone. Is it when the heart stops beating? Is it when the breathing stops? Is it when brain waves cease? If life is more than cells and bodies, is it about the material or is it about the immaterial? Is life intrinsically, infinitely valuable? Now, intrinsic refers to something that has a self-contained worth, not dependent on other sources. Infinite refers to a worth that cannot be diminished by other circumstances. Now, the Judeo-Christian tradition says that life is a gift from God. It has an intrinsic worth, independent of its cognitive function, because we're told in Scripture that our purpose is to worship God. For whom is life valuable? There may be times when it's only valuable to God, because He's the one that knows the purpose for that life, a purpose which oftentimes human beings can't see. For Christians, respect for life is based on the giver of life, and not some utilitarian sense of a value that we hold, meaning greatest good for the greatest number, ease of definition, etc. What is death? The ending of life? A process? Or is death the condition of having life over? You see, death can be a state, a process of extinction, a final completion of that process, that moment. Now, Christians hold that lives are not permanently ended when these earthly bodies break down. Resurrection will come. And so, can a creature continue? A philosophical question is, can a creature continue to exist after life ends? Can a person? Philosophical ethics plays with the question, can a person continue as a person after their life ends? And that's because they're looking at personhood as entailing the possession of all of our psychological attributes. And in order to possess them, that requires that the being be alive for all those psychological attributes to work. However, persons may cease to exist, that is to die, while their bodies survive. And persons may survive the demise of large parts of their bodies. For persons, death means the destruction of our identities. But what about our identity in Christ? When talking about death, it's important to distinguish between the concept of death, whether it's a state, a final moment, process, and a criterion of death. The concept says what death is, perhaps the cessation of personal survival. The criterion establishes a condition sufficient for death, and by which an individual's death may be determined. Now, the traditional definition of that is heart and lungs cease to function. Oh, no pulse. But a much more recent, in the last 30 to 35 years, a much more recent definition of death is the cessation of brain activity. Doesn't make it any easier. Why do we have that new criteria? Organ transplant. In other words, if somebody has said that they want to be an organ donor, and they're out on their motorcycle, and they don't put their helmet on, and they're in an awful accident, and they're in the ER, from here up, they're a mess. And the only thing from here up that is working is perhaps the brainstem or some part of the brain, deep down inside. But if it's that stem, the stem is convincing the heart and the lungs, hey, keep going. You're working. As long as they can keep that brain activity going, well, let me say it, I said that wrong. As long as there is brain activity, the person is not dead, even though they have told you that there is no chance of your loved one coming back from this kind of an accident. And so when that brain activity ceases is when they say death has occurred. Another question to ponder. Is death always a misfortune? Do you ever notice how, even as Christians, we hear that somebody has died, and what are the first words that we say?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
My condolences.
My condolences. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but is death always a misfortune? Some people would argue only a premature death is a misfortune.
What ladies are premature?
Right, thank you. How do you define a premature death? Somebody lives to be 107 years old.
Could still be premature?
How do we know it's not premature? How do we know that the miscarriage was premature? We have, as human beings, when we see stories of the 20 kids in Newtown, we see that as premature because we look at their chronological age and we believe that every one of them was going to live a full, long, wonderful life. And they might have, and maybe they wouldn't have. Who knows? Got lost here for a minute. I want to move into an aspect of life and death. Something that comes up especially in Roman Catholic healthcare settings, but it is something for Christians of all faiths to ponder, and that is the issue of the sanctity versus the quality of life. All of our modern life-prolonging technologies have raised this issue of sanctity versus quality of life. Our ability to sustain vital signs raises all kinds of questions. Do we value life just for those electrical impulses that we can keep going? Or do we value life for the qualities that might be enjoyed by the person? Those two questions can leave families and healthcare providers, not to mention patients, in limbo. Indeed, they also can leave the courts in limbo, thinking back to the Shivo case. It raises questions of when is life inviolate and needs to be protected at all costs? When is life just some electrical twitchings on a monitor? And when is life somewhere in between those two extremes? We live in an age where healthcare professionals, for fear of liability, employ more and more heroic methods to preserve life. So, let's pull them apart. The sanctity of life position. What does it mean to attribute sanctity, sacredness, as opposed to quality, great value to life? Well, I'm going to try and lean over the tables anyway. Bless you too, thank you. That's it, that's good. Just those two? Now I don't. Okay. There are two, when we talk about sanctity of life, there are two conditions under sanctity of life. One is the ultimity condition, and the other one is the equality condition. Ultimity condition says that the value of life exceeds every other value. No other value overrides the value of life except perhaps more life. The equality condition of the sanctity of life says that all lives are of equal value. There are no priorities. Not for the fittest, over the vegetative, fittest over the wretched, over the immature, etc. The ultimity condition makes it easy, indeed it makes it necessary to choose life over any other non-life value. The equality condition makes it impossible to choose among lives. Now, the ultimity, misspelled that. The ultimity condition can be absolute, it can be infinite, and it can be maximum. Absolute ultimity says that there's no value in the world is absolute except life. Infinite ultimity says that the value of life is infinite. There's no finite value in any combination that can override the value of life. And the maximum ultimity says that life is the greatest finite value you could find. Why do I tell you all this? Well, because this is at the heart of issues in Roman Catholic healthcare settings of birth control, abortion, vasectomies, tying tubes,
Sterilization.
Sterilization is, yes, is what I really want to be saying. All of those things. Life is sacred. It's absolute, it's infinite, and it's maximum. The sanctity of life position makes it absolutely wrong to kill life or to shorten it. There is an unremitting duty under this sanctity of life principle to preserve life.
DNR, where does that stand in that?
Well, it does, because in Roman Catholic healthcare settings, they have had to embrace DNRs. They did not initially want to, 50 years ago or so when we first started bringing them into reality, but they have come to realize that there may be times when you do have to make that decision, but you have to make it as long as it's not, and we'll come to this in a minute, as long as it's not a quality of life position, okay? I know it sounds like I'm dancing on a pinhead. I am. But it's important for you to understand how we dance on a pinhead in these areas, because when you are talking to healthcare professionals, you may have a Roman Catholic doctor whose personal belief is in the sanctity of life, and you're wondering why the doctor isn't engaging you along the line of treatment that you're interested in. So what is this life that is so sacred? Well, sanctity of life says that a person's health, happiness, comfort, convenience, financial interests, aesthetic enjoyment, moral convictions, all of that, they say, are non-life values. And even though all of that is derived from a living person and would be extinguished by her death, they are values other than life. The life that has sanctity, says the sanctity of life position, is biological vitality. It is not some complex powers and interests that we psychologically call a person, but it's brain activity, pulse, respirations, breathing. Indeed, if you start talking about a conscious person, or you start talking about rational moves, rational decisions, you have moved out of sanctity of life into quality of life, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. Sanctity of life says that you keep alive a comatose, brain-damaged person who can only live in a vegetative state on a machine controlling respirations and circulations. Sanctity of life says you keep that person alive, even if that would mean taking resources from less valuable obligations, because it is a life. Quality of life would not agree with that. Sanctity of life never faces a dilemma about whether to save or not, unless all cannot be saved. Now, the quality of life position, well, that is a little more difficult for us to state. It relies on concepts of quality, values that are at best fluid, and at worst indeterminate. Generally, quality of life says that the value of life varies with its quality. The value of life is dependent upon circumstances. Not all lives have equal value, says the quality of life position. There is no ultimity within quality of life. The value of life does not exceed all other values, say quality of life people. So in medical cases, Relevant parameters would be issues of the imminence of death, the constancy of pain, the ability to think clearly, to enjoy life, to make rational choices, to be independent of drugs, machines. Now, outside of the medical sphere, that might also include a desire to live, the level of satisfaction with one's life, the ability to change one's situation, one's circumstances. The motive for this quality of life position is to articulate conditions under which life is worth living. So the concept of a life not worth living is central to the quality of life principle. And it comes into play when there's competition for scarce resources. Quality of life would not let a brain-dead patient with machine-driven pulse and respirations occupy a hospital bed when healthier patients will become brain-dead without access to that hospital bed. The usefulness of this notion is that it helps us make decisions that medical cleverness has forced us to make. The quality of life position is a position of modern times, born from our need to cope with machines that redefine what is life and what is death. The life not worth living cannot precisely be described, and that's probably for the best. But it does raise the question, worth living to whom? Quality of life speaks of a life not worth living to the individual. Not next of kin, not society.
Now, how does that vegetative person make the determination that their life on a machine where they can't move, think, or make this determination?
And this is where the rest of us come into play. Because think back, it's a good example to think back on. I know it was 8 years ago, but in the Shivo case, the husband said that she wouldn't want to live this way, and the parents said that you can't take a life. What did you have there? You had quality of life versus sanctity of life. The parents saw life in this woman who was in a persistent vegetative state. No judgment of either of the parents or the husband. The husband didn't see life because it wasn't the quality of life that she had had. I know we're closing in on the end, but this is a perfect point to refer back to a story right here in Massachusetts. I don't know if any of you remember this, but 11 years ago, on January 3rd, 2002, in a senior citizen's home in Needham, Massachusetts, Admiral Chester Nimitz Jr. and his wife, Joan, put a note on the door of their unit. The note said, "Do not resuscitate, do not dial 911 in the event we are discovered unconscious but still alive." Nimitz was, of course, the son of the famous Chester Nimitz from World War II. He and his wife, at the time, he was 86, she was 89. They had 3 children. He had been raised a Roman Catholic, but had abandoned any interest whatsoever in religion, God, etc., even though he had a sister who was a Roman Catholic nun. At the ages of 86 and 89, his arthritis made it almost impossible for him to get out and take walks around the grounds of this senior citizen home in Needham. her cataracts had gotten so bad that she no longer could see. She couldn't needlepoint, she couldn't read. These were the things that the Nimitzes believed were of major importance in their life. They were the things that gave their life quality. And so, neither one of them wanted to leave the other one to fend for him or herself. And so on January 3rd, 2002, the two of them committed suicide together. Talking about quality of life, and I'm only smiling because the article in the New York Times said, yes, they did it on January 2nd or January 3rd, 2002, meaning that they had divided up their estate, and it meant that their children and grandchildren wouldn't have to pay taxes on it for another 363 days. That's why I'm smirking. Now,
Yeah, they were thoughtful.
I bring that up because it's a classic example of what quality of life is about. When life is reduced, and I say this with respect, when life is reduced to needlepoint, reading, and walking, as wonderful as all those things are, and it does not have anything deeper to it, quality of life decisions will be of major importance to us. How many times have you heard somebody say about a loved one, oh, you know, it was time for them to go. They couldn't enjoy the opera anymore, or they couldn't enjoy their photographs, or whatever the case. Those are all quality of life statements.
Or they couldn't even enjoy eating anymore.
Right.
By eating.
Right. Those are all quality of life statements. And as Christians, I'm not arguing that we have to take a Roman Catholic point of view. I'm just trying to say sanctity of life has a lot more to tie into our understanding of life as Christians. And really will have a major effect when we get to that point with loved ones about decisions that we have to make. Now, I know I went the whole way, but I was trying to get through everything. So anyway, next week, we're continuing with ethics and various issues, and we're kind of off kilter, and I have an idea of what I'd like to do next week, which I haven't talked to Ben about, but possibly come in with a case, an actual case, and have us talk about the ethical implications. So anyway, I think that's what we're going to do, if that sounds...
Sounds good to me.
All right, good. Next week, we're going to put all this stuff to work, okay? You can feel free to take anything that's on the table, bring it back next week if you want a cheat sheet.
I can't remember her name.